Chapter 136 Cursed. Are you afraid of me, Mia? Of course not, Mia said shortly, but she realized as soon as she said it that it was a lie. When the kiss had begun, she'd understood instinctively that, somehow, kissing her had brought him a kind of peace and assurance, and she'd wanted to give him that. But when she'd heard him whisper that he wanted and needed her, and now that her heart had taken that kiss as an urgent demand to give him much, much more, she was terrified. Because she wanted to do exactly that. She wanted to feel his strong hands rushing over her naked skin and his body driving into hers. She wanted him to touch and do things to her. Mia went still as she realized how much she wanted to be touched by him. But in the moments she'd been silent, Neil had evidently replaced his passion with anger, because his voice was no longer gentle or kind. It was cool, clipped, and hard as he said, "If you aren't afraid, then what's bothering you? Or is it that you can give an escaped convict a little empty sympathy, but you don't want him too close because you are disgusted by his touch? Is that it?" Mia nearly stamped her foot in frustration at his narrow logic and her own stupidity for letting things go this far. "It's nothing like revulsion if that's what you mean." His voice became a bored drawl as he asked, "Then what is it, or shouldn't I ask?" "You shouldn't need to ask," she said, raking her fringe off her forehead as she looked around the living room a little wildly for something to do. Some way to restore order to her mind and heart that had suddenly become alarmingly out of her control. She needed to keep her hands busy before she'd lost it completely. "I'm not an animal," she began. Her eyes fell on a picture frame on the wall beside her that was a fraction of an inch crooked, and she turned around to fix it. "And you think I am? An animal? Is that it?" Trapped by his questions and his closeness, she glanced over her shoulder and noticed a cushion on the floor. "I think," she told him flatly as she walked over to the cushion to pick it up, "that you're a man who has been locked away from women for 5 long years." "That's right, I am. So what?" She placed the cushion at a vertical angle against the arm of the sofa and began to feel more relaxed, now that there was distance between them. She gazed at his face and actually managed an impersonal little smile at him across the length of the sofa as she said, "I can understand that, to you, any woman would be like a..." His dark brows snapped together over ominous gray eyes, and she trailed off uneasily. Then she hastily bent and began rearranging the other pillows into a more artistic display. She didn't know how to phrase her words in a way it wouldn't be offensive, but she tried to continue with her explanation. "To you, after being in prison for so long, any woman would be like a banquet to a starving man." "Any woman," she emphasized. "I mean, I didn't mind letting you kiss me if that made you feel, well, better. But you see," Neil suddenly felt humiliated by her words, and furious at the discovery that she regarded him as some animal to whom she'd been tossing a crumb of human feeling, a sex-starved beggar to whom she was reluctantly willing to give a little kiss. And with those thoughts, his pride and ego took a big hit. "How generous you are, Miss Harrison," he jeered, ignoring the way the color drained out of her cheeks as he continued with deliberate brutality. "You've sacrificed your precious little self twice to me. But regardless of your opinion, even an animal like myself is capable of some sort of restraint. In short, Mia, you may think you're irresistible, but you're completely resistible and undesirable to this particular man, sex-starved though I may be." His anger was palpable, terrifying, and completely incomprehensible to Mia in her agitated state. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as if to fend off the hurt he was deliberately inflicting on her raw emotions. Neil read her every reaction in her expressive eyes, and satisfied that he'd done the utmost possible damage, he turned on his heel and walked over to the cabinet beside the television, where he began looking over papers he'd kept there the last time he came to the cabin to occupy his time. Mia knew she'd just been discarded like a used piece of tissue and summarily dismissed, but her ravaged pride rebelled at the thought of creeping into her bedroom like a wounded rabbit and crying because of his insult. She refused to shed even one tear or show any fluster. She decided and walked over to the table behind him and began straightening the papers on it. But his frigid command made her lurch upright. "Go to bed. What do you think you are by cleaning the house? Some sort of compulsive housewife?" The papers slid out of her hand. They scattered to the floor and she glared at him, but she did as he told her. She turned on her heels and walked upstairs toward her room. From the corner of his eye, Neil watched her retreat, noticing the stubborn lift of her chin and the proud grace of her walk, and with the skill he'd perfected of blocking out his emotions and people when he was a boy, he turned away and coldly dismissed her completely from his mind. He concentrated, instead, on the news that Mia had interrupted with her angry outburst. He could have sworn that while he was trying to comfort her, the reporter had said something about Kai. Sitting down on the sofa, he frowned at the television screen. He wished he had just focused on the news than her earlier. She had completely ruined not just his mood, but his news time. In 2 hours or so, there would be a late-night news update or at least a recap. Since he couldn't use cell phones here, he was left with waiting on news. Propping his feet on the coffee table, Neil leaned back, prepared to wait for that while making sure he blocked out every thought of Mia. Instead, he let himself think about Kai. The boy's face with his daredevil grin took shape in his mind, and a faint smile touched his lips as he thought of him. In all these years, there were only 2 men who he had come to regard as true friends, almost brothers. One of them was Liam and the other was now Kai, who he was now worried about. Just before midnight, as Neil hoped, they re-showed the same news along with a brief video that Neil had already seen earlier in the day. Then he waited until the reporter spoke about Kai. Kai Martinez, who was recaptured after his escape with Neil Weiner, was taken for questioning, where he attempted a second escape. 2 guards were assaulted before he was finally recaptured and subdued. He has been taken to the prison infirmary, where he is listed in critical condition. No additional details as to the nature and extent of his injuries are available as yet. Neil's whole body turned cold with shock and rage, his stomach heaved, and he leaned his head back, fighting down the urge to vomit at the thought of the young man being in critical condition because of him. He had warned Kai not to attempt anything stupid, but the boy had obviously proved to Neil that he was indeed inspired by anything Neil did. And he proved that by attempting an escape. Neil stared at the ceiling high above, swallowing convulsively as memories of Kai's grinning, optimistic face and foolish jokes flashed across his mind. Long after the news had ended, Neil remained where he was, so filled with torment and despair that he couldn't summon the energy to get up and go to his room. The determination to escape and survive that had kept him sane for the last 5 years was slowly draining away. It seemed as if death had been at his side or stalking him from behind forever, and he was suddenly tired of running from it. First his parents had died, then his sanity, and then came many lives he had killed. If Kai died, there was no way to blame anyone except himself for it. He was to blame for everything. Sitting there, Neil actually felt as if there were some sort of macabre curse attached to him that sent anyone he cared about to an early death. Even through his despair, Neil realized thoughts like that were dangerous, unbalanced, insane. But then he felt as if his hold on sanity was becoming very, very fragile. Very soon, he would lose it. Chapter 137 Sleepless Night. The next morning, Mia walked out of the laundry room carrying the small bundle of clothes she'd just taken out of the dryer. She padded barefoot and wet-haired through the silent living room and into the room where she'd spent a nearly sleepless night. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, and judging from the sound of rushing water in the next room, she assumed Neil had also slept late and was now in the shower because he had woken up late just like her. She hadn't been able to sleep throughout the whole night until it was dawn, and now she had woken up with a terrible headache that throbbed whenever she bent down. She went through the routine of blowing her hair dry, then she brushed it and pulled on the trousers and sweater she had worn 3 days ago when she drove to Novaria. That morning seemed like weeks ago, because it was the last time everything had been normal in her life. Now, nothing was normal anymore, least of all her feelings about herself. She'd been taken against her will by an escaped convict, an event that would have made an ordinary, decent woman hate her kidnapper and despise everything he represented. Any other woman would have fought Neil at every turn while simultaneously trying to foil his plans, escape from his clutches, and get him recaptured and sent to prison where he belonged. That's what a good, decent young woman would do. But that wasn't what Mia Harrison had done, Mia thought with bitter self-disgust. No indeed. Instead, she'd allowed him to kiss and touch her. Worse, she had liked the feeling and didn't want it to stop. Last night, she'd pretended to herself she only meant to comfort an unfortunate man, that she was merely being kind as she'd always been, but in the harsh light of day, she knew that was a complete lie. If Neil had been some other man, she wouldn't have flung herself into his arms and tried to kiss away his unhappiness. Nor would she have been so eager to believe he was innocent. The truth was that she'd believed Neil's ridiculous words of innocence because she wanted to believe him, and then she'd comforted him because she was disgustingly in love with him in the past. Instead of escaping and getting him recaptured at that rest stop yesterday morning, she had lain in the snow and kissed him, ignoring the very clear possibility that if she were to scream for help, Neil might not be able to shoot all the truck drivers down before they'd escape and get him captured. For the past 5 years, she had carefully evaded any sexual advances of any other men, including Owen, her fiancé, by making him believe that she wanted that to happen after their wedding, while hypocritically congratulating herself for making him wait. Now, however, the truth was glaringly and painfully obvious. She'd never been sexually attracted to any other men, and now she understood why. It was because she could only be attracted to the first man she'd ever loved, a murderer. Other men, who were decent, didn't turn her on, but a dangerous, violent, temperamental Adonis obviously did. As those realizations dawned on her, she froze momentarily before she began to hear voices from her past ring in her ears, voices of people cursing at her for what was never her doing. Did you think you can ever come clean of this, Mia Harrison? No, you can't. You are a murderer as much as Neil Weiner. You told him to kill Diane and Alaric and your poor mother. A nurse at the hospital you were admitted in reported to the authorities about your mom telling you to stay away from the gray-eyed man, but you refused. And when she must have insisted, you sent him to kill her so you could be with him. You are a devil in the shape of an angel. May the Lord punish you and may you rot in the pits of hell along with your lover. You killed them. You are to blame for Neil Weiner's crimes. You should be sentenced to prison along with him to rot in there. Oh, look who is here, the devil herself. Don't let her use her sinful hands to touch any of your things before she'll put her curse on it. Her poor mother must be so disappointed in her. Mia squeezed her eyes closed, trying to shut out the painful memories and voices from the past to concentrate instead on Rain's voice and Owen, who'd agreed to marry her and had worked hard to help restore her image in society. It's not your fault, Mia, they would assure her whenever she started to blame herself for things she knew nothing about. And whenever she hated herself for harboring any feelings for Neil, Rain would always say, "It's fine to love the man you thought he was. Don't beat yourself up for something that is out of your control." Mia braced her hands on the dresser and bent her head, thinking about those words. "You were wrong, Rain," she whispered brokenly. She realized the ugly truth now. She wasn't just attracted to the man she thought he was. Instead, she was attracted to Neil Weiner himself, regardless of what he'd done and who he was. He had fascinated her from the moment she saw him on the rooftop of Ivy Grove Library, and he had again now. And the revolting truth was that she'd wanted to go to bed with him last night, and he'd also known it then. Mia knew that was the real reason why he had been angry and disgusted with her when she called a halt to the lovemaking. He'd been angry at her cowardice and her insult of indirectly calling him a sex-deprived animal. She'd wanted to go to bed with him as soon as he began kissing and touching her. And as all those realizations settled on her, she couldn't help the self-disgust that overwhelmed her at once. She was ashamed of herself for daring to want a murderer, a short-tempered psychopath. She had to leave him before she'd end up doing something she'd forever regret in the future. Make up your mind, Mia. Slowly, Mia lifted her face and gazed at her reflection in the mirror while a new strength, a new force, built inside of her. She hadn't yet done anything that was completely inexcusable. Not yet. And before she did something to betray herself and her upbringing, she was going to get the hell out of Neil Weiner's clutches. No, she corrected herself grimly, she was going to get the heck out of his life and get him out of hers completely. Today. She had to get away today, before her weak will and fragile morals crumbled in the face of his dangerous appeal. If she stayed, she would become his accomplice in fact, and when she did, she would sink beyond social and moral redemption. With an almost hysterical strength, Mia vowed to get away from him today no matter what. Walking over to the bedroom wall, she pressed a button on the wall and the dark, one-sided glass wall revealed the outside world. She glanced out at the gray, ominous-looking morning with soft snowflakes descending. Overhead, heavy snow clouds were piled high and the wind was howling through the pine trees, rattling the roof. As she stood there, mentally trying to retrace the route they had taken up to the mountains, a few snowflakes blew past the glass and she grimaced inwardly at the sight. In the past days, she had seen enough snow to last her a lifetime. She wanted to go home and relax her exhausted nerves. Mia lifted her head, startled by the sudden sound of the television. The man who had caused her all this misery was obviously dressed now and in the living room, probably waiting for the news to be shown again. For a minute, she considered trying to lock herself up in this nice, warm room until he finally left for wherever he was going, but that was impossible and impractical. She'd still have to eat, and even if she locked the door, she couldn't do anything about the windows. Moreover, the longer she stayed with him, the less chance she had of convincing the authorities and the citizens of their country that she hadn't been a willing accomplice nor the bedmate of a murderer. With a nervous sigh, Mia faced the fact that the only route to freedom and to restore her respect in society was outdoors, across this unfamiliar snow-covered mountain. If only she could figure out a way to take back her car keys from him, that would have been much better than to walk on foot and freeze to death. But if she was going to escape on foot, which seemed likely, the first requirement was for her to find warmth. She had to make sure she would be warm throughout her long journey. Turning away from the glass wall, Mia headed for the large walk-in closet, hoping to borrow some of his warmer clothes. A few moments later, she uttered a little cry of joy at her luck. Near the back of the closet were what seemed to be one-piece snowsuits for adults. They were two of them, both black, as usual for a man who was obsessed with dark color, but one was much smaller, and when she held it up to herself, she knew it would fit her perfectly. Tossing it over her arm, she returned to the bedroom and began searching through the contents of the drawers of the nightstand. A moment later, she suppressed another laugh of delight as she brought out a long-sleeved, long-legged set of thermal underwear from the drawer. Like the snowsuit, it was her size when she put it on. However, she struggled afterwards to button her trousers over the thermal underwear, and once she finally did the button, the trousers were so tight she couldn't bend her knees, but Mia barely noticed the inconvenience. Her mind was on the best way to deceive Neil into relaxing his guard long enough for her to escape and, if she had to leave on foot, to trick him somehow into not coming after her until she had an excellent head start. For that reason, she delayed putting on the snowsuit for the time being. At present, it seemed far wiser to make him think she was simply going outdoors for a few minutes to get some air. "You can do this, Mia," she assured herself determinedly. Chapter 138 Treacherous Heart. Fixing a polite expression on her face, Mia pulled the bottom of her own sweater and jacket over her hips, hoping Neil wouldn't notice that her legs looked and moved like a pair of stiff, overstuffed sausages. Then she opened the door and walked downstairs into the cozy living room. Mia's eyes went automatically to the sofa by the fire where she expected to see him. Instead, he was across the room, staring out the glass wall at the falling snow, his imposing back turned to her, his hands shoved deep into his trouser pockets. Delaying the moment when she would have to face him for the first time since last night, Mia watched him lift his hand. As he absently rubbed the muscles at the back of his neck, her treacherous mind suddenly recalled how skillfully those long fingers had caressed her breasts and the sweet pleasure he had made her feel for the moments they had kissed. It occurred to her at that moment that he actually deserved some credit for showing a certain amount of restraint and decency last night. He had been as physically aroused as she was last night, she remembered, feeling her face grow warm at the vivid memory of his rigid groin pressing against her. She had aroused him and then unintentionally insulted and angered him, and yet he hadn't tried to resort to rape. He was a murderer after all, a criminal, and resorting to force her into being sexual with him wouldn't be surprising, but he hadn't done such thing. As she stood there looking at his imposing back, he turned his head slightly to the side and she saw the stern pride stamped on that handsome profile, the firm mouth that had kissed her with such soul-destroying passion. Surely a man who was capable of so much tenderness and restraint, even in the throes of passion, and when he hadn't been near a woman in years, couldn't really be a murderer. Mia quickly gave herself an angry mental shake. She was being an utter fool again, standing here feeling sorry for the villain, romanticizing him, simply because he was tall, handsome, and incredibly sexy, and because she was an idiot, a spineless idiot who was disgustingly and helplessly in love with him in the past. "Ahem, excuse me," she said animatedly, raising her voice to be heard above the loud television sound in the background. He twisted around, his gaze immediately narrowing on her outdoor clothing. "Where do you think you're going all dressed up?" "You said," Mia replied, matching his cold tone perfectly, "that I could have the run of the house and grounds. I'm going crazy being stuck indoors. I want to go outside for some fresh air." "Fresh air? It's freezing out there," he pointed out with a furrowed brow. Realizing he was on the verge of refusing her, Mia switched quickly to a calm, logical approach. "As you pointed out, I'd freeze to death if I tried to escape on foot." I just need some physical exercise and fresh air. All I want to do is explore the yard a little and, she faltered. Then an idea struck her and she tried to inject a childlike eagerness in her voice as she continued to say, I want to build a snowman. Please don't say I can't, she pouted childishly. I haven't seen this much snow since I moved to Whispering Way as a little girl. I've always loved to play in the snow. He wasn't impressed, and he wasn't friendly as he said, do whatever you want, but stay where I can see you from these glass walls. Yes, sir. Mia forced a tight smile, but deep down, she was angered by his high-handedness and aloofness towards her. But may I be allowed to vanish from view now and then, just to gather up branches and the other things I'd need? She asked. Instead of answering, he lifted his brows and regarded her in cold silence. Mia decided to take his silence for a yes, even though she knew it wasn't intended as anything of the sort. She had made up her mind to get away from him, and to accomplish that urgent goal, she was prepared to stoop to almost anything, including acting cute to calm his aloofness. When I was a little girl, I used to give my snowmen carrot or cucumber noses, she told him happily, and with her small ability at acting, she smiled a little as she added, I'll look in the refrigerator to see what we have so I can use them on my snowman. She headed towards the kitchen. The refrigerator was beside the kitchen cabinets, which she had noticed last night contained some oddly shaped keys to unknown locks. With her left hand, Mia opened the refrigerator, and with her right, she silently pulled the cabinet drawer open, her fingers groping for the keys she had seen the other day. No carrots, no cucumbers, she said over her shoulder, glancing up at Neil with another fake, innocent smile. Then she sneaked a quick look in the cabinet drawer. She saw one of the keys and picked it up, but she knew there had been more than just this one yesterday. As she was about to close the drawer, her eyes fell on the other keys. 3 other keys peeking out from under some mixing spoons. With her eyes on the contents of the refrigerator, Mia managed to pick up another one of them, but her shaking hand and long fingernails made it impossibly awkward to pick up the other 2, particularly without looking. Just when she nearly had one of them, she heard him move, and when she looked up, he was walking straight toward her. Mia quickly yanked her hand out of the drawer and closed it, with 2 keys pressed in her palm, her voice shaking with anxiousness as she asked, What do you want in the kitchen? He glared at her. Something to eat, why? Nothing, just wondering. She scooted past him as he walked towards the counter. Help yourself, she said. He paused, his gaze following her as she walked stiffly over to the kitchen exit. Why are you walking like that? Is something wrong with your legs? He asked, his cold voice betraying a hint of concern. Mia's mouth went dry. Nothing. I found thermal underwear in a drawer and wore them under my clothes, so I could stay warmer when I'm outside building my snowman. He gazed at her face as if searching for something. Then he spoke to her with a stern voice as if she were a child. Stay close to the house where I'd be able to see you, he warned. Don't make me come looking for you. I will, she lied with a smile, already opening the door of the storage closet where she had seen some winter helmets and thick gloves stored in there yesterday. What do you think I should use for its eyes and nose? She asked, deciding to blabber about the details of her snowman in hopes of boring him into letting his guard down. I don't know and, to be perfectly honest, I don't give a damn, Harrison. Go do your thing and leave me alone, he said, pulling out something from the cabinet. Putting on a look of guileless enthusiasm, Mia looked over her shoulder as she looked through the new winter boots in the storage closet while ignoring his warning to be left alone. When I was a little girl, I used to wish my snowman would come to life just like the one in Frozen, she told him, unconsciously using a girlish tone. Have you watched Frozen? No. I'm not surprised. I bet you don't even watch movies, she said ingenuously. Instead of replying, he studied her in speculative silence for a moment. Then he rudely turned his back on her and returned his attention to what he was mixing in a bowl. Mia would have dropped all further attempts at conversation, but she had just thought of a way to make him so bored he wouldn't care to find her later on when she disappeared from his view. Since you haven't watched Frozen, I'll gladly tell you the story and what I like about the movie. Elsa is my favorite of all, and there are times I wish I had her magic. She could build a castle made of ice, and a living snowman, Olaf, who happened to also be my favorite. Can you imagine having a company like a cute talking snowman? She laughed, pulling on a pair of waterproof gloves she found inside the storage closet. Glancing over her shoulder with a bright smile as she stood up and closed the storage door, she added, Isn't that interesting? He took a knife out of the cutlery drawer and opened a cabinet. Fascinating, he mocked in a flat tone. You don't sound very fascinated, Mia complained, determined to annoy him into telling her to go outside and leave him alone, which was exactly what she wanted to do. I mean, the least you could do is try to concentrate on my story and ask me questions. You should ask me what Olaf sounds like and what Elsa's magic is like. If you even want, I can tell you the story scene by scene. All right, I will tell you. He slammed the cabinet door with a loud crash that made Mia swirl around, and her gaze immediately fell on the knife in his fist. Mia, he warned, shut that little hole on your face. His sudden mood swing would have been enough to remind her that Neil Wayner was a dangerously unpredictable foe, but with a knife blade flashing in his hand and his eyes glittering with menace, he looked fully capable of committing cold-blooded murder. And at that moment, Mia felt all blood drain out of her face. The scene of walking into a room and finding her mother's dead body flashed into her mind. Neil saw the color drain from her face, he saw the way she was staring at the knife in his hand, and he knew exactly what she was thinking about him. His simmering anger built to a fury. That's right, he taunted. I'm a murderer. A cold-blooded murderer. But you said you didn't do it, she reminded him, trying very unsuccessfully to sound calm and convinced. I said that, he jeered in a silken voice that sent chills down her spine, but you know better, don't you, little one? She swallowed repeatedly and started backing away from him. Can I go outside now? Without waiting for him to answer, she grabbed blindly for the door of the kitchen and opened it, and without waiting for a second, she rushed out. Behind her, Neil stood perfectly still, fighting to calm himself and to block out the horror he'd seen in her face. He told himself it didn't matter what she thought or that she had looked adorable chattering about a talking snowman or that she was sweet and good and clean and that, compared to her, he felt inhuman and filthy. Chapter 139 Pleasure in Watching Her from the Glass. Impossible, Mia said softly as she slid out of her car, which was still parked at the back of the house, out of sight of the glass wall at the front and sides, where Neil had told her to stay. She had watched in movies where the actors would start a car without the keys by just joining some wires together, but she hadn't the slightest idea which of the wires she would pull from beneath and start the car. Now, she'd given up on using the car to escape. Shivering uncontrollably, she bent down and began to gather up the armload of pine branches she had collected and raced through the wind and snow to the side of the house earlier. For the entire 15 minutes that she had been outside, Neil had remained at the glass wall, watching her like an expressionless stone statue. The excuse she'd given him about gathering branches and other things needed for the snowman had enabled her to vanish from his view for a few minutes at a time without rousing his suspicions, exactly as she'd hoped it would, but she was afraid to be gone too long. So far, she had made 3 short trips of increasing duration, returning each time with pine branches after trying to start the car without keys. She was counting on the hope that he'd soon decide she was actually idiotic enough to spend her time building a snowman in freezing weather, and he'd grow bored with his guard duty. Raising her arms, Mia pulled the thick winter cap she had taken from the closet down over her frozen ears. Then she began to roll the bottom ball of the snowman's body, while she reviewed her remaining alternatives for escape. To try to escape on foot would be suicidal insanity in this weather, and she knew it. Even if she didn't get lost trying to get down the mountain, she'd likely freeze to death long before she reached the main road. If by some chance she did make it, she'd surely die of exposure before any car came along. On the way here, they hadn't passed another car for the last 2 hours. The possibility of finding out where he'd hidden the keys to her car seemed equally remote, and she couldn't start the car without them. There has to be a way to get out of here, Mia said aloud as she pushed and shoved the ball of snow closer to the pile of pine branches. There was a padlocked garage at the back of the house, which Neil had told her was used for storage and thus couldn't accommodate her car. Maybe he was lying. He was a liar after all. One of the keys in her pocket looked like it was meant to fit a padlock, and the only padlock she had seen anywhere was on the side door of that garage. The possibility that he had another car in there did little to elevate her spirits right now. Assuming she could find the car's keys and get it started, her BMW 7 was blocking the garage door. That left her with only one likely option. Even without seeing the inside of the garage, she had a hunch what she was going to find inside of it was going to be skis. She had seen ski boots inside the storage closet, but no skis in the house, which meant they were probably in the garage. She had never skied in her life, but she was prepared to try. Besides, it didn't look very hard whenever she saw people skiing on television and in the movies. How hard could it possibly be? Children could ski. Surely she could, too. And so could Neil, she realized with a thrill of raw fear. This was possibly his house. He wouldn't keep the skiing boards if he didn't know how to use them. Grunting as she rolled the heavy snowman ball through the snow, making it fatter and fatter, Mia finally moved it into position 10 minutes later, panting heavily like she'd just moved mountains. Finished with the first 1/3 of the snowman, she quickly scattered the pine branches around it in a half circle as if she had some plan in mind. Then she stopped and pretended to contemplate her handiwork. From the corner of her eye, she stole a sidelong glance at the glass wall, and saw that he was still there, immobile as a stone guard. It seemed he wouldn't be getting bored anytime soon. It was time she looked into that locked garage and see what she would find. She decided as she made her way to the back of the house while making it seem like she was going to search for branches. But when she arrived there, her gloved hands turned clumsy from suspense and cold. Mia tried unsuccessfully to fit the first key she had found into the bottom of the heavy padlock. Holding her breath, she slid the second key into it, and the lock separated into two parts in her hand. Glancing over her shoulder at the back door of the house, she made certain he hadn't suddenly decided to come outdoors. Then she stepped into the garage, closing the door behind her. Inside, it was dark as pitch, but after stumbling over a shovel and bumping into an unknown object with tires, she finally found a light switch on the wall and flipped it on. Immediately, it illuminated the entire place. Momentarily blinded, Mia blinked and then glanced around the crowded area, her heart beginning to hammer with anticipation and dread. Skis. There were several pairs of ski boards secured in a rack at the wall. On her left was a brand new black Lamborghini. Mia tried to envision herself sitting inside the Lamborghini, driving her way along the treacherous road that wound down the mountain. Then she immediately discarded the possibility. Even if she were reckless enough to try to push her BMW out of the way and drive the Lamborghini down the mountain, the car would make enough noise to alert the man in the house. Moreover, due to the snow ground, it would move so slowly that he'd be able to reach her without breaking into a run. The other half of the two-car garage was filled with car equipment, snow tires, boxes, and some other equipment that was covered with a large black tarpaulin. Now she was left with just one option. She was going to have to try to ski her way down the mountain. If she didn't die of cold, she'd probably die of a broken neck. Despite her desperation to get away from him, she'd have to wait until tomorrow or the day after to try it, because the wind was picking up outside and the snow was beginning to fall as if it were a real blizzard. More out of curiosity than hope, Mia lifted the corner of the tarpaulin and peered underneath it. Then she threw it aside with a cry of joyous disbelief. Beneath the tarpaulin were two shiny, dark purple electronic snow bikes with helmets perched on the seats. Fingers trembling, she tried the button on the snow bike. Its light immediately came on. It worked. Joy and anticipation soared through her as she raced out of the garage and carefully closed the side door behind her. The weather that had seemed so forbidding a few minutes ago didn't matter to her again. In a half hour or less, as soon as she could change into that snowsuit in her closet and sneak out of the house, she'd be on her way to freedom. She had never used a snowbike before, but there was no doubt in her mind that she could manage somehow, and much better than she could have handled those skis. Determined on keeping up the act of building a snowman, Mia paused long enough to grab some more pine branches, then she dashed to the side of the snowman and dumped the branches there, as if she had been gathering them all this time. Neil was still standing at the glass wall, watching her, and Mia forced herself to pause and look around her as if searching the yard for more objects to use for her snowman, while she gave a last few seconds thought to the details of her forthcoming flee for freedom. All she truly had to do was change clothes and put on dry gloves and destroy the other start button of the snowbike so he wouldn't be able to follow her when he realized how she had escaped. She was ready to go. Neither snow nor wind nor an escaped convict with a gun could stop her now. From within the house, Neil watched Mia clamp her cap down over her ears and trudge off out of sight to look for whatever it was she needed to create whatever unidentifiable thing she was making out there. Was that supposed to be a snowman or some hideous monster? He had been watching from within to see whatever she intended to make, but up till now, it was unidentifiable. The anger he had felt earlier was gone now, greatly alleviated by the news that Kai's condition hadn't worsened and, to a lesser extent, by the unwilling amusement he felt as he watched Mia wrestle with that enormous ball of snow, pushing and shoving at it, even though she could barely bend over in those tight trousers she was wearing. His lips quirked in a half-smile as he recalled watching her solve the problem with her hideous monster. When the snowball was large enough, she had stopped pushing it with her hands and arms, and instead, she had turned around, braced her back against the snowy stone, and shoved it using her feet and legs. Neil had been sorely tempted to go outside and help her, an offer that he knew she would angrily reject and would have simultaneously deprived him of the pleasure of watching her from his vantage point. Until that moment, he had never imagined there could be such pleasure in simply watching a woman build a snowman. On the other hand, he had never known a grown woman who would consider doing such an ordinary, innocently wholesome thing as play in the snow. But Mia Harrison was different. She seemed to enjoy it more than anything. Chapter 140. She's Gone. Mia Harrison was a complete enigma, and as he stood there, a memory from his childhood flashed through his mind. It was a time in winter when he'd asked if she'd play outside in the snow, but the little girl had pouted her lips and shook her head. "I hate snow. It makes me sick. I don't like playing in it," she had told him. And ever since then, he'd never asked her to play in the snow with him again. Nonetheless, here she was now, all grown up and playing in the snow. She'd even told him earlier that she liked playing in the snow as a little girl, which he'd thought wasn't true but didn't point that out as he knew her memories were messed up. People change, and Mia Harrison must have gone through a big change throughout the years he'd been away from her, Neil thought as he waited for her to reappear at the glass wall again. If there was one thing about this Mia that intrigued him the most, it was her unaffected wholesomeness. At first, he'd been half convinced he was imagining that aura of prim innocence, but last night he'd discovered that she barely knew how to kiss. It made him wonder if that bastard fiancé of hers had ever even touched her. And what sort of inconsiderate jerk was Owen that he hadn't introduced her to foreplay? She jumped like a startled rabbit when Neil touched her breasts. If he didn't know it were impossible in this day and age, he'd almost think she was still a virgin. He had once told her to remain a virgin, but what right did he have over her to tell her what to do? Those words had subconsciously slipped out of his mouth then, and he wasn't expecting her to follow his words. In this day and age, no woman of 26 would remain a virgin because she'd been told to. Nevertheless, he'd liked the feel of her full breast in his hand. If she hadn't stopped him last night, nothing would have stopped him from taking her to bed. Neil realized where his thoughts had ventured and he uttered a silent curse. Then he turned in surprise at the sound of Mia coming inside the house through the back door. I need some clothes to put on the snowman," she said with a brilliant smile. "Why don't you wait until tomorrow to finish it?" he said, and her smile died. "But I'm having fun," she protested, sounding desperate. "What pleasure can you possibly get in denying me something to do to occupy my time?" "I'm not a demon," Neil snapped, hating the fear and mistrust in her brown eyes. "Then let me finish my snowman," she snapped back at him. "All right," he said with an annoyed sigh. "Fine, go do whatever you want." Another one of her innocent smiles appeared, lighting up her entire face. "Thank you." Neil melted beneath the radiant heat of that smile. "You're welcome," he said and was surprised by the gentleness he heard in his own voice. On the television playing in the background of the house, another news came up and the reporter said they had another development in the Neil Weiner escape that would follow the next commercial break. Trying to hide his reaction to her behind a curt nod of dismissal, he watched her race into the bedroom. Then he walked into the living room and turned up the volume on the television before he walked back to the kitchen. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee when the reporter said something that made him stop dead in his tracks and all the colors drained from his face. 10 minutes ago, an unnamed source at the prison in Novaria Infirmary phoned with the information that Kai Martinez, who attempted to escape days ago with Neil Weiner, died this morning at 9:20, while being transferred by ambulance to the city hospital. Mia was walking out of the bedroom, the snowsuit hidden behind her back, when she heard the reporter's words followed by a bellow of rage from the man in the kitchen and an explosion of shattering glass as he hurtled his coffee mug against the wall of the kitchen. Out of his direct line of vision, Mia stood, momentarily paralyzed with terror, while Neil hurtled everything he could pick up against the walls and floor, shouting vivid offensive words and violent threats at the military and the entire country. She saw the toaster crash against the floor, followed by a blender and the coffee machine. Then he swept his arm along the counter, sending dishes, cups, and glass containers crashing into shattered heaps on the floor. He was still cursing when the counters were clear, and then, as quickly as his anger had erupted, his explosion of maddened wrath seemed to come to an abrupt end. As if he'd exhausted both his rage and his strength, he braced his flattened hands against the countertop. His head fell forward and he closed his eyes as a single tear rolled down his cheek. Snapping out of her mesmerized horror, Mia wisely abandoned all hope of destroying the other snowbike with the screwdriver she planned to take out of the drawer beside his hip and hurried down the hall, her back pressed to the wall. As she opened the door, the eerie silence in the kitchen was shattered by his tortured groan. "Kai, I'm sorry, I killed you, too. Forgive me, I'm sorry I let you down as well." The frightening scene she'd witnessed rolled around and around in Mia's head as she raced through the swirling snow to the garage and stumbled through the doorway at the side. Her fingers trembling in their haste, she changed into the snowsuit, pulled on the gloves and helmet. Then she began dragging the snowbike toward the door, afraid to turn the machine on for fear of whatever noise it was going to make. Outside, she swung her leg over the seat, struggled with the strap on the helmet, and pressed the start button on the snowbike. The snowbike sprang to life with much less noise than she expected it to make, and moments later, she was moving in speed over the snow toward the woods at the far edge of the yard, struggling to keep her balance, praying that the snowbike wasn't loud enough to be heard inside the house. Shaking with a combination of exhilaration and fear, Mia sped through the trees, fighting for control of the machine beneath her, sideswiping pine branches and avoiding boulders beneath the snow. When she was well out of sight of the house and certain he wasn't following her, she would turn the snowbike toward the main road and follow that down to the highway, but for now, she was glad of the need to keep in the woods. Beyond the woods' shelter, the wind had already risen to a howl and the snowstorm was working itself into a full blizzard. 5 minutes became 20, and a sense of success and freedom gave her courage, but its joy was unexpectedly diminished by the memory of the grief she'd witnessed in the man she had left behind. A thought occurred to her that it seemed unfitting, in fact, almost impossible, that a cold-blooded murderer would feel such anguish at the death of his cellmate. Mia glanced over her shoulder to make certain she wasn't being followed. Then she cried out in alarm as she nearly hit a tree, but she was quick to swing the bike wildly to avoid it and almost overturned the snowbike. Shoving himself upright, Neil looked blankly around him at the broken appliances and broken glass on the kitchen floor. "Fuck," he cursed dully and reached for the wine cabinet. He poured some of the red liquid into a glass and tossed it down his throat, trying to numb the ache in his chest. He kept hearing Kai's cheerful voice, "Brother Neil, my dear mom brought me a homemade chicken soup. I saved some for you." He remembered, then gulped down his wine as Kai's voice repeatedly rang in his mind. "I can help you with your escape plans. My family has deep connections." Neil had let him help, and now Kai was dead because of it. Standing at the glass wall, drinking the wine and staring blindly at the hideous snowman Mia had been building, Neil could almost feel Kai's cheerful presence beside him. Kai had found such delight in stupid little things. If he was here, he would probably have been out there with Mia, building the snowman. Neil froze, the wine glass suspended partway to his mouth, his gaze searching the yard. "Mia! Mia!" he shouted, rushing toward the back door and jerking it open. A blast of snow hit him in the face and he had to put his shoulder to the door to force it open in the rising wind. "Mia, get in here before you freeze your..." The wind hurtled his voice back in his face, but Neil didn't notice. His gaze had shifted on the deep footprints already filling up with snow and he found himself running, following the footprint that led him towards the garage at the back of the house. "Mia!" he thundered as he slammed the side door of the garage open. "What the hell do you think you're doing in here?" Neil drew up short, momentarily unable to believe the answer he saw with his own eyes as his gaze moved from the snowbike sticking out from beneath a tarpaulin to the doorway. There, a set of snowbike tracks began and led straight into the woods. A few minutes ago, he would have sworn that he was incapable of feeling any angrier or more desolate than he had at the news of Kai's death, but the explosion of fury and dread he felt at that moment overruled even that. His hands clenched into fists,